Gender politics are at the core of Dream of the Red Chamber. The disparity between men and women in Dream of the Red Chamber is a constant and recurring theme. It's also a theme that I don't think people pay enough attention to. In fact, it's so prevalent in this book that I'm overwhelmed with textual examples, and I'm only about 3.5 chapters into my translation out of 120. Now, I know that it's kind of odd for me to talk about gender politics. I mean, I'm a guy after all. Now, Cao Shuiqin, the author of Dream of the Red Chamber, was also a guy. And he's the one who ended up writing all of this. Anyway, for now, because this is the book that we're reading and talking about, I recommend sort of not paying too much attention to how can this man say this thing or think that thing. And instead, let's just read what it is that he says and worry about his qualifications maybe a little bit later. So at the beginning of chapter 4, we meet a female character named Li Wan. We see her from Lin Dayu's perspective. Li Wan is Lin Dayu's cousin-in-law. She's the wife of Lin Dayu's mother's nephew. Or if you look at it from Jia Baoyu's perspective, Li Wan is his sister-in-law, though of course she's quite a bit older. Well, it's kind of a complicated family relationship, I know. In fact, we'll get to that in a second. Understanding the family dynamics and the politics going on not only will help us understand why characters act the way that they do, but it also really shines a lot of light on what Cao Shuiqin is saying. Li Wan's husband, Jia Ju, passes away sometime before Lin Dayu comes to the Rongguo mansion. Naturally, the fact that her husband passed away doesn't help Li Wan's status in the family much. However, the text specifically states that she was fortunate to have a son, a child named Jia Lian, who is about 5 years old when Li Wan is introduced. Well, her son is actually quite important. He's the reason why she has any status at all in the family. And as it turns out, his very existence is important to the survival of the family line. Now, the way that Li Wan is described in this section is incredibly important. You see, it helps us understand what Cao Shuiqin is saying in Dream of the Red Chamber. And I cannot emphasize that point enough. If you are skeptical that Cao Shuiqin was actually writing a subversive book, and I know that you're out there, this is really the part to pay attention to. In my opinion, the character of Li Wan lays bare just what Cao Shuiqin thinks about the society around him. Cao Shuiqin explains that Li Wan is the daughter of a man named Li Shouzhong, who was a renowned official in Jinling, the capital of the country at the time. In fact, Li Shouzhong had served as director of the Imperial Academy. That's how I'm translating this phrase, which says guozi jijiu. Jijiu originally meant an officer in charge of drink offerings, but later was used in the educational context to refer to somebody who was in charge of the schools. Now, Li Wan's family had a long tradition of literacy both for men and women. However, her father decided to change that. His motto was 女子无才便是德, which means a woman without talent is virtuous. Okay, let's stop right there. Before we get to the rest of this, we really need to talk about that statement. None of the English translators of this book will tell you this, but that was actually a statement that had been swirling around the Chinese academic and philosophic circles for about a century by the time that Cao Shuiqin wrote this book. Fortunately for students like me, there's this Wikipedia article that goes into considerable depth about where the phrase comes from, but my apologies, it's only in Chinese. Anyway, the phrase apparently originally comes from a guy named Chen Jiru, who said, "For men, virtue is talent. For women, the lack of virtue is talent." This was in a book of aphorisms that he allegedly compiled sometime in the middle of the 17th century. Now, it's obviously not clear where this phrase originally came from, and it might have just been a common saying in the later years of the Ming Dynasty. Anyway, Chen Jiru also provided commentary saying that he agreed with this phrase, that it was better for women to remain illiterate and dutiful. Now, the crazy part is that there was actually some academic debate on the subject. Take this line from Li Yu, for example. Talent and virtue aren't mutually exclusive. Not all talented women are immoral. How can you then say that all immoral women must be illiterate? In contrast, some others, such as Zhang Shuicheng, took what we'd consider a moderate viewpoint. Zhang Shuicheng noted that women in ancient times were actually literate, but that they studied virtue, speech, appearance, and skill in addition to reading and writing. But of course, the character Li Shouzhong takes the more extreme point of view, and this is not just some rhetorical device that he uses. In fact, he apparently gave Li Wan her name because of how he felt about this very subject. Now, we know that Cao Shuiqin was a fan of giving his characters names with double meanings or even multiple layers of hidden meanings. In the beginning of this book, he tells us about why he gave out the names Jia Yucun and Zhen Shiyin. Here he also tells us why Li Wan has her name. It's because her father saw sewing and other domestic duties as her job. In fact, the word wan means a kind of raw silk. Her domestic fate was not just determined by her father's politics, it runs as deep as her own name. The book goes on to explain that Li Shouzhong also gave her a courtesy name or nickname, Gongcai, which means palace tailor. Now, this isn't to say that Li Wan was completely illiterate. However, the kind of lessons that she learned really should shock and appall you, whether you're male or female. Li Wan learned enough characters to read the 4 books for women and biographies of exemplary women. Cao Shuiqin likes to make up fake book names, but both of these are actual texts, believe it or not. Well, the name The 4 Books is a reference to the 4 Confucian classics, of course, which served as the basis of all thought in classical Chinese education. The 4 books for women were 4 works created particularly for girls. They're called the Admonitions for Women, the Analects for Women, the Instructions for Women, and a Short Record of Model Females. These books generally emphasize submission, chastity, and performing domestic duties. Similarly, the biographies of exemplary women can be thought of as the female version of the various biographies that exist in the large and famous Chinese imperial histories. The women featured in these books were supposed to be paragons of moral virtue. However, just a glance at the table of contents will give you an idea of the sort of virtues that the author, of course a man, valued in women. Many of the stories praise women for self-mutilation and even for taking their own lives in the names of virtue and chastity. Well, depending on where and how you grew up, some of this might actually strike you as uncomfortably close. Now, I'm telling you, Dream of the Red Chamber is just as relevant today as it was 250 years ago. More people should read this book. Next comes a phrase that really stands out. So, while talking about her life in luxury as a widow with a son, Cao Shuiqin describes Li Wan as Gao Mu Si Hui. This is a phrase that has a very specific philosophic implication and that can be very tricky for translators. This phrase originally comes from the Zhuangzi, which is one of the most famous ancient philosophic Chinese texts. So Zhuangzi tells a story of a teacher and a student during the Warring States period. The student sees his teacher leaning on an armrest and gazing into nothing while exhaling slowly. The student then asks him this question, which translates as, "Can the body truly stand as withered wood and the mind grow cold as dead ashes?" So this phrase was shortened to Gao Mu Si Hui over the years, or withered wood and dead ashes. Well, it was also used in a positive sense, as if sort of staring off into the distance was the way that we gain enlightenment. In other words, staring off into the void and thinking about nothing is apparently that enlightenment that we all want to achieve because it involves complete detachment from the world around us. But wait a second, Cao Shuiqin is using this to describe Li Wan, whose life has been mostly useless. The full phrase sentence should be translated like this: although she lived in luxury, she remained like withered wood and cold ashes, utterly detached from worldly affairs. Now, if we think about the Zhuangzi connection, we can certainly consider this to be a positive thing. So maybe she achieved enlightenment the easy way by simply spending her entire life sewing and then seeing her husband die young. But the next sentence makes our interpretation difficult. All she knew was serving her elders and raising her son, passing idle hours in needlework, and accompanying her younger sisters-in-law at their studies. So let's take a step back here. Li Wan is born into a scholarly family. She might have had scholarly abilities, we don't know. She's given a name that curses her to an existence of doing sewing and domestic chores. She marries into wealth, her husband dies extremely young, and now she's living out an empty existence while she's being surrounded by all sorts of wealth. All she can do is look after the old people and watch as the younger girls in the household receive a real education. So what do you think? Is this positive or is this negative? Well, I've complained about David Hawkes' Story of the Stone translation in the past, and it's time for me to complain again. So here's how Hawkes translates this passage. Thanks to her upbringing, this young widow, living in the midst of luxury and self-indulgence, was able to keep herself like the withered tree and dead ashes of the philosopher, shutting out everything that did not concern her and attending only to the duties of serving her husband's parents and bringing up her child. Now, this translation is not entirely correct. So the Chinese phrase here is 一概无问无见, which means that she shut everything out, not just things that didn't concern her. She was basically sleepwalking through life. But the bigger problem I have with the Hawkes translation is that he misses the discussion about gender roles. In fact, you can see that with how he translates that Li Shouzhong phrase. The correct translation of this phrase is something like, a woman without talent is virtuous. David Hawkes, however, seems to think that this is one of Cao Shui-qing's jokes. He translates it as "a stupid woman is a virtuous one," which seems laughably over the top in English. And the problem with that translation is that it takes a lot of attention away from the point that Cao Shui-qing is actually making. He's making a very specific point about a philosophic debate that still raged at the time. You see, Li Wan is the embodiment of what happens when the men in charge arbitrarily decide that women should be slaves in their own home and not receive any education. They create the living dead. They create zombie women with unfulfilling lives. And of course, the great irony here is that Li Wan is actually the most important woman in the Jia family. You see, Li Wan's son Jia Lian is one of only 2 possible male heirs to the family fortune. The other one is Jia Baoyu, who isn't exactly the model Confucian son. Now, the part that goes unspoken here, the part that you really have to dig a bit to find, is the way that the family politics works. Li Wan should have a place of prominence among the women since her son is one of the 2 possible heirs to the fortune. However, she winds up being swept to the side and given a subservient role while Wang Shifeng takes charge. Wang Shifeng is in charge of the family finances and from a political standpoint is the strongest character in the Jia family. And I don't just mean the strongest female character, she is the strongest character in the book without question. She runs the show. In fact, if you read the book carefully, you will notice that none of the men of the household are actually around when important decisions are being made. It's always the women running the show and it's always Wang Shifeng who's in charge, and there's a reason for that. Wang Shifeng eventually has a daughter named Qiao Jie, but we're a long way away from meeting her. Wang Shifeng also has no son, which theoretically should limit the influence that she has. But it doesn't. Wang Shifeng is the only person who understands administration, and so she takes the task upon herself. And as you've probably already guessed, she's actually really corrupt. Li Wan, meanwhile, spent her life learning submission, and therefore she takes a back seat, even though she really should be in the driver's seat. And the real interesting part, of course, is what this means about Jia Baoyu. There's this famous scene near the end of the 3rd chapter where Jia Baoyu throws a fit. You see, Jia Baoyu has a piece of jade. It's the one that was allegedly in his mouth when he was born. He asks Lin Daiyu if she has one because he recognizes that she's very talented. She says that she doesn't. And so Jia Baoyu gets upset and takes it off and starts to stomp on it, which causes everybody to hurriedly intervene. He then complains that none of the girls in the house have a piece of jade, and that it must be a bad thing if none of the girls have one. There are some obvious gender politics and sexual references at play here, but there's actually another level of interpretation. You see, everybody freaks out when he stomps on the jade, but it's not because the jade is magical or they think it's magical, but rather because of what he represents to the family. Well, since Jia Ju is dead, Jia Baoyu is the hope that the family has for holding on to its fortune. In fact, the biggest hope that they have for him is that he can pass the imperial examinations, since the tenuous ties that the Jia family has to royalty are crumbling away, but we haven't quite hit that part of the book yet. Now, Jia Baoyu is no dummy, and he can clearly see how important he is. I mean, he just met the beautiful Lin Daiyu, who came to the family because his grandmother insisted that she come to the family. There's a lot of matchmaking being alluded to here, and it's really important. After all, they really need Jia Baoyu to calm down and to play that role of the dutiful Confucian son, and it's a role that he simply refuses to play. Well, when I first read Dream of the Red Chamber, I thought of Jia Baoyu as a sort of punk rocker, like the ultimate nonconformist. Now that I'm reading it more slowly and more carefully, however, I think he's actually a lot more pragmatic than I first thought. Jia Baoyu can clearly see the uselessness of the men in his family who never seem to be around when important things are decided. So is there any wonder that he wants to spend all of his time with the women? Now, Jia Baoyu rejecting the jade is not about him rejecting his own gender. Instead, it's about him rejecting his gender role. And the family cannot have that. They need him to be the chosen one, or that special son who was destined by heaven to rise up and save everything. So in other words, when Jia Baoyu makes these comments about women being like clear water and men being like mud, he's not engaging in some sort of gender dysphoria. What he's actually doing is he's rejecting the toxic masculinity that he sees around him. And that is exactly what Cao Shui-qing's point has been all along. Okay, let's go way back to the beginning of the 1st chapter of the book. Check out what Cao Shui-qing says here. Seeing that I've accomplished nothing in the midst of the hustle and bustle of this world, I started to think about the women I used to know. When I really thought about it, I realized that their actions and insights far surpassed my own. Then he continues with this phrase, which is absolutely famous. Though I am a grown man with a mustache and beard, I am truly no match for their skirts and hairpins. And then later on, I know that I have many faults, and yet the memory of those girls remains strong. It would be awful to let their memories fade away completely just to hide my own shortcomings. Well, there are a few other subtle ways that Cao Xueqin brings up the gender politics of his day. I'll touch on only one more example in the interest of time. When we met Lin Daiyu, her mother had just passed away. Her father, Lin Ruhai, tells her at the beginning of chapter 3 that she really ought to go live with her grandmother because he's 50 years old, he's not going to remarry, and because her mother's family could help guide her. Now, the real reason is because Lin Ruhai's family has no male heirs. No male heirs means that he can't pass on his possessions or his legacy when he dies, because he only has a daughter. That's how the law worked in the Qing dynasty. And the lack of male heirs in his family means that they have very little leverage when it comes to marrying off his daughter. He wants her to live with the Jia family because she would have a better chance of a good marriage. Now, Lin Daiyu is an incredibly gifted poet and scholar. She is easily the most talented character in this book, and that's really saying something. I think you could argue she's the most talented character in all of Chinese fiction. Almost all of the girls in this book have fantastic literary skills, but hers stand out the most. However, even Lin Daiyu's own father cannot see her talent or worth beyond her domestic duties. Anyway, I could go on and on with these examples, but I think you mostly get the point. There are different ways to interpret this all naturally, but at least for me, I'm convinced that Cao Xueqin was actually quite critical of the gender politics of his day. Today we would say that he's very forward-looking, that he's very modern, I guess. Oh, and by the way, David Hawkes, in contrast, who wrote the Story of the Stone, he tends to downplay these interpretations, especially if you read him carefully. In my mind, that says a lot more about the sort of person that David Hawkes was than anything else. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys again with more.